Presentation today. And we're giving our presentation today on affect and personnel validation in the archives, where we're going to have a dialogue about where we're going to encourage authentic relationships with the primary materials that we work with and serve. So just a little bit about us. So I'm currently in my very last course, in my very last class in my MLIS at LIU, where I'm also receiving my advanced certificate in archives and records management. Um, Before that, I received my master's in food studies from New York University, where I also worked at the NYU Special Collections Reading Room. Presently, I am doing two part-time jobs. One I'm doing as a contract and records management consultant with the children's publishing house Lee and Low Books. And I've also started working as the bookseller and the food historian at a new cookbook shop in the East Village called Wild Sorrel.
And my name is Lauren. I am currently in my final or approaching my final semester at Pratt Institute, the Advanced Archives Certificate. Before that, I got a master's in experimental humanities and social engagement from New York University, where I mostly studied queer history and literature. Currently, I'm a collections processing associate for e-resource acquisitions at the New York Public Library, but that also I'm really involved in e-resource records management and creating an archive for them. Um, this will all become very important in the kind of things that we're discussing. I also worked at NYU Special Collections, which is how we met.
Mhm.
And a lot of this stems from experiences that started while we were at NYU and kind of goes along into what we were doing after.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the points of our emotional engagements with the materials themselves really kind of stems from the very fact that we were focusing a lot of our scholarship in gender and sexuality spaces. And we began to notice systemic issues with our own research, dead ends, and then also the emotions that we were encountering within ourselves, but also with other people that we engage with within the archives, be they colleagues or employees and curators themselves. So with that, I kind of want to lead into probably the one emotion we're all way too familiar with in this profession, which is frustration. So frustration, because we have this relationship with it, kind of brings it within itself a lot of reactionary measures that kind of take place in these work environments. So we're going to be engaging with experiences like burnout. We're going to be experiencing fatigue. Um, and then also some of these like limitations of what we can and cannot do in some of these spaces, depending on our authority or our accreditation.
Emotional labor is a huge tenet that's discussed or at least mentioned in a lot of the readings that I've done during my library science education. However, it really seems like emotional labor is mentioned, but no one or not very often are is that really tackled in any way that feels productive or like actually answering the systemic issue that librarians and archivists are required to provide this emotional labor. It's a tenet of public service, whether we like it or not. And so a lot of the experiences that we've had in internships, working at NYU, our own experiences as researchers, it's really quite fascinating how the sidelining of these emotional realities really accelerates the burnout, fatigue, and apathy that are felt by librarians and information professionals everywhere. And there are limits to that compartmentalization that we do to go one day to another. And just being at the beginning of our careers, it's fascinating at how quickly that systemic issue really bubbled up. And that frustration just seems unfortunately to be one of the major feelings within library science people.
And it even kind of translates into other spaces I was not necessarily expecting. I don't think either one of us was expecting was just a butting up against of leadership structures that sort of reflect back a feeling of indifference towards the issues that they're bringing to their attention. Like I experienced this a lot in archival creation with the publishing house about the importance and value of indexing things a particular way, or organizing them in a particular way, and then kind of coming up against a, like, well, that's nice, but however, and just trying to figure out a way to manage that without also internalizing the emotions of that indifference within itself. Um, I think that deserves some sort of acknowledgement too. Um, Mostly because I think that those are levels of barriers that can happen with inside of the educational process that should be conveyed a little bit more clearer. Because I think there's a lot more emphasis on theoretical approaches and structure of an archive, but no one tells you about the emotional boundaries and the sort of grit you need to develop in some of those spaces in order to work with the leadership that you're assigned with.
I mean, these are tenets of librarianship that cannot be answered by HR departments alone. This is more of a systemic thing. It's yeah.
So, so digging in deeper into some of these areas too is like when we talk about beyond the lack of transparency and trust, we also find a lot of frustration when it came to researching, especially when it came to what we can provide, and then what we could actually find in ourselves, because we've worn both hats. We've been on the receiving side as researchers, and we've also been on the providing side as people who've worked in a reading room. And so we go through the emotions, and at the same time we have a unique position to kind of understand the emotional process that's happening. So a very clear example for me was kind of really understanding the way that how gendering inside of cataloging systems have broad reaches, and the way of how information can be found and the way it's categorized inside of finding aids, and how they sort of superimpose themselves from PACs. So the way that things can be found is not entirely direct. And when you're studying something specifically unique, like food, food studies within itself carries a lot of gendered weight because of a lot of the performances that are happening with food are often by women. And so when women aren't categorized in the archives appropriately, it means that food within itself is becomes more obscure, by its association with the gendered norms. And and then when finding aids are starting to become lumped in with larger organizational pressures, like more recently, the Schlesinger collection at Harvard was folded in with Hollis. And I just know from other colleagues within the food studies program who are also doing their own research within food and history have basically started right back at page one with trying to understand how to find materials, how to request copies, all those measures because of just externalized pressure and the way that those structures influence themselves upon those institutions as well.
I think understanding more about the lack of transparency and trust that I've at least felt on the researcher, but also the librarian side of archives, is these vicious cycles of archive structures when it comes to not being able to find what you expected to be there. This is obvious, well, as many of us know, a result of donor permissions and privacy, things like HIPAA, and there becomes this really frustrating experience of knowing that something is in there, but having the inability to access it, especially in restrictions, which I know you have more experience for.
Yeah, like when it comes to restrictions within themselves, like there's the HIPAA requirements, and then there's also the copyright restrictions. And then when you factor in copyrightability in relationship to whether or not it's been actually physically published, when it was created, not understanding when all that was done, and then when it's actually owned by an institution versus just existing in absentia, it kind of changes the way in which those materials can be accessed, and actually recorded by yourself within your own research. Like when doing my own research on a protest that took place at NYU back in the 70s, there was a radio interview that I could only transcribe. I could not make any copies or request copies of it just by the very nature of what it was, that it was a replica of something that was owned by a third party, and then they control the access to that information as well. So that makes a lot of my reliance on this source and thinking about publishing with that source a little gray. And it definitely kind of complicates the narrative that this interview creates in relationship to that research as well.
And even with the material itself, getting into the building is frustrating enough. During our time at NYU, I was experiencing or listening to the experience of a researcher that was coming in every day for several weeks. Mm. But every single day he tried to come inside. The security people were offering different ways to get in. We have NYU has an email that you're meant to present to the security people to let you past and go into the archive, but it's a cell phone dead zone. So you don't have access to get to your email. So he would screenshot it, and then one day that was fine, and the other day it wasn't. And so every day, one of the reference associates would have to go down and check his name on the list, even though it was already on a list, to get him inside. And venting this frustration, he's going in every day for several weeks, and yet he was having trouble getting access to the building when, while the university itself is private, the archives are meant to be public. So there's this real tension in being able to reconcile those, especially for this wonderful researcher who we were just having a wonderful time with, to experience these issues again and again and again. It didn't matter how many times he'd been there, he would experiencing it every day.
So, so I think that a lot of this frustration kind of like brings us into this other space, which is, oops, disappointment. And when you're researching queer history, you encountered this emotion a lot. Um, there are profound gaps in the way that certain communities are recorded and indexed within the collection. And when those actions become deliberate, it reflects into expectations that become that become defeating, and they become discouraging to the extent where you're just sort of like, why am I continuing on? Um, like like when we would go through the labor of finding a box because it has a folder that's just labeled by an organization. You go in, you're waiting days for that box to come in from an offsite spot. You've made your appointment, you're ready to go, you're excited to look in there, and it is a single piece of paper, not even the right date that you were looking for. And it's pretty dejecting as someone who is really expecting something to come from this because it's inside of a collection that you're just like, it's very interesting that this exists here, and I kind of want to understand the context as to why. And that context is completely gone by the very nature of the fact that it just wasn't even accounted for in an inappropriate way. And I also try to think about that, like if I were doing this myself at that point, how would I have done that differently?
I think this also, and this will come up often. A lot of these issues are a result of lack of resources, which is certainly a continuing issue, especially with this administration. Thinking about how we might have done things is, I think, a valid response. But on the other hand, what was the accessioning archivist, the person writing the finding aid too? What were their issues? What were their pressures in providing a very detailed finding aid or lack thereof? But even then, the finding aid is not the only problem or disappointment that is experienced within an archive. For example, when I was doing a lot of work for my graduate thesis on lesbian pulp fiction, I was very interested in how the industry itself of pulp functioned during the mid-century, the 50s and 60s. And I went to the then curator and asked if there was any information he might have had. And I was because we had nothing in the boxes other than the pulp itself out of context. But there was nothing within that archive, and I was guided to Archive Grid only to find that what was in Archive Grid was also disappointing. That there seems to be almost no records of the corporate existence of these age-old lesbian pulp publishers, which is understandable, but frustrating and disappointing nevertheless.
Yeah, and that too can sort of be a reflection of just sort of what's happening as those frustrations sort of filter down into the environments in which we create. Um, and I think that we kind of have to know that the work that we're doing is valuable in relationship to the things that people are going to find. But a lot of that is also dependent on like if I'm going to be creating a finding aid, do I have the bandwidth? Do I have the time? Do I have the funding? Do I have the resources? And do I even have the support of the people I work with or who people who work with me who are able to take the weight, put in the time, support me, stand up for me? And then to also know that I would be willing to do the same. That if they have a project and if they have something that actually has profound significance to the way that the archive is structured, that we should be kind of standing up for each other and also standing up for our institution as well in order to get the resources that we need. Because I think that there is too much of a reliance on efficient means of providing resources for our users and for our researchers without really taking in the human capital that is being involved in the creation of these efficiencies. Because efficiencies usually rely on an exploitation, be it of time, resources, or of someone's creative input. And that within itself, I think, is also a bit disappointing um, to not have that support, or at the very least know that there is a lot of literature out there that encourages these kind of behaviors, but doesn't really kind of provide for a solution. And that I think is also a missed opportunity with inside of the pedagogical programs. And so then, as we move deeper and deeper into pain, I think it's really important to also sort of acknowledge the fact that grief and sorrow is definitely a very real thing that happens in archival spaces. Um, I think a lot as a queer person, there is there's always a consistent narrative, and this comes even just working in children's publishing, where we publish queer books. And then as someone who is looking for queer materials, having to go to queer specific facilities in order to get the accurate record of something, is that seeing yourself reflected in a collection is really important for validation, especially for knowing that your existence spans across decades and centuries rather than a moment in time, as much as it's perceived to be that way. Um, but also knowing that if you go looking for something and it's not there, it's it is also sort of a collective sorrow that can come from knowing that a part of your history is missing, even though you kind of know that it's there, or just also knowing that a tremendous loss is taking place that is not really taken into full consideration for accounts like I think of the the HIV/AIDS epidemic and just the stupendous dark age it created for queer artistic and social development. And just everything that was lost. And I think a lot of it is not really fully accounted as to just how devastating the pandemic of the AIDS epidemic was. Um, and then and I mean, and even now it is sort of an emotional reflection. And And then I think of all of the methods of organization with ACT UP. I think of Mattachine Society, and just the way that these are indexed and outlined and placed within a collection, or they're only placed in such a specific way where you happen upon them, but you never really originally see them, is sort of a bit of a surprise, but also it's a bit of bit of a grief because it's like, how was I supposed to know this was here? Who was supposed to let me know that I could find this here? Um, yeah, I don't know.
I when I think of at least expressions of grief and sorrow within archives, there was an article I read for one of my courses last semester that discussed First Nations people in Canada and how there's an archive in Alberta that has a special room to express the grief and sorrow. And this really lends so much trust towards that researcher, that person who is experiencing whose materials of a genocided community, and even the architectural ability to feel and express grief and sorrow is not expected in archives, in institutional archives. They're either modeled after a gentleman's office or an Apple store. So there's hardly comfort or a point of trying not to feel uncomfortable and in order to feel and express the grief and sorrow that is intrinsic within archives, the rehoming of something in the first place. And I really wonder about what might be able to happen if there were more access to these private rooms that offer trust to researchers and people that are experiencing their own archival materials, that are experiencing materials that reflect their own people. And how might that be instituted in institutional archives, and how whether or not they can trust the people that are provided the materials to look at when it is their materials. And I think it's worth it to think about the expression of grief and sorrow and how you cannot remove it from the experience of archival materials in the first place.
Yeah, like that sense of ownership as part of the aspect of engagement is really is really visceral to see happening in real time. One of the collections that was being viewed by it's being viewed by the immediate family of one of the engineering professors at NYU. His wife was there just to kind of see what the collection looked like because it had gone through a complete refresh on a lot of the photographs that were in the collection. And as she was going through it, she found that there were family photographs that she did not realize were a part of the collection and was very visibly upset and vocally upset. Um, and it was very obvious that the curators and the management were a little bit shocked as that this was the reaction that was taking place, and then simultaneously not knowing how to assuage the problem, or not necessarily assuage the problem, but sort of identify that there is something happening here, and there was a way to sort of help her understand, or at least come to an understanding as to how this information ended up where it didn't belong in her view. And and even though she feels that this is her photograph, she feels that this is her property. And in essence, it is, but it's not. And that's an odd duality to kind of exist in. And it's sort of like, it's sort of seeing a child that you know is yours, but you can't touch it and you can't be with it. Um, and that's kind of a stage of separation that is something I don't think a lot of us are really prepared to engage with, especially when it comes to the donation process and the accession process, especially if these are materials that are been knowingly surrendered for decades, and then sometimes they just don't really understand the changes of policy and the changes of time between the time when they surrendered information to surrendered items to when they're accessing it 20 years later, and knowing that the things have materially changed within that time frame. So then let's drop the ice cube in this. So of course, it's really important to even also acknowledge the good stuff, which is the joy. Um, I think the point of a lot of this, and the point of us wanting to even just have this conversation, was to really kind of talk about not so much the cloud, but in order for there to be a silver lining, there has to be a cloud. But we do really do enjoy the good days when they do come. Um, and there is definitely a lot of joy to take from from this work. Um, and I think of the joy is what's what kind of what makes you show up. Um, but the joy is in deterring that finding yourself as a queer person within the archives is sort of actually seeing the information there. I knew that in the 1960s, there was a legal precedent that ended discrimination of LGBT people within the federal government. But going to the Gay and Lesbian Archives here in New York and actually getting touching a physical copy of the court order issued that was in the Mattachine collection was profoundly impactful. It completely made what happened in our past very real. Um, in order to have it being printed out and dispatched and then have the wet ink signature of the judge in your hands makes makes the actual true trajectory of the queer rights movement very tangible and present. And it kind of lets it be known that there is still work that can be done and things can in fact happen. Things can change for the better.
I mean, even in my experience, while I was working on my thesis, I was reading a bunch of lesbian pulp fiction and gay pulp fiction. And what really struck me is while the content remained much the same with a lot of sexual content, a lot of quote trashy, lowbrow type uh, plot points. But what I found really fascinating was how the author's notes and acknowledgments changed over time. How at the beginning of the pulps that I was looking at when pulp came over to the United States in 1950, many of the author's notes were condemning homosexuality, saying, oh, we do not support this, but we're going to let you buy it anyway. And as I started to go through the decades where pulp was at its height, I got to the 1980s where things are kind of petering out. And I found an author's note of a book called Blue Boy. And the author's note was, you can tell when the people that are working at these publishers completely flips because the author's note was explaining and lovingly saying, oh, this is who we are, this is who we love, this is what we do. And then I look at the address of the publisher and it's about 10 minutes from where I grew up, which was kind of crazy, especially because that area is much more conservative than I had. Well, it was much more conservative in 1980, I'll give you that. But the fact that there's that perseverance, there's that resilience, and the inability to rewrite that history because it was capital, it was a commodity, and how that was able to exist and continue to exist, it really brought home so many of the joys that I had experienced while working on this work. Um, and to feel to feel literally seen was a wonderful experience. And it's, when we wonder why we do this in the first place, like that, this is why,
Mhm.
or one of the reasons why.
Yeah, like I will definitely know that just like some experiences that really stand out to me too is just post Stonewall, all the organizations that used to call themselves homophile turned into gay. And it tells you that just by the very action of a protest taking place, the physical record itself changed. And seeing that changing in real time, seeing it in the Heitzman from NYU stating that we are no longer going to call ourselves the Student Homophile Association or the Gay and Lesbian Association. And seeing these declarations happening, in real time, in the times and when they happen, just shows you just like the ripple effects of events and how those changes are taking place in the physical record. Um, and that's sort of the part that just makes it so great, is just knowing that even though it may not be indexed appropriately, it may not be labeled right, it may not be dated right, it's just like I try to take it as is just like, it's just so great that it's at least here. At least it's being kept safe. At least it's being preserved in some way, whether or not they fully understand what it is that they have. Um, and I think that that's such a great sense of acknowledgement that it's just sort of like, while I am doing a lot of this extra work to have to come across it, when I do come across it, it's just like it's just so great. Um, and it really helps too to kind of encourage and not internalize the joy you kind of feel for yourself as a researcher, but also for the researchers that you care for and that you serve. Um, and I remember one of the last things I served at Special Collections was a silk sample created by a young Irish immigrant girl. In the turn of the century, they would teach young women how to manufacture fabric, and they would have to stitch the ABCs, create a sock, put together a shirt, and it would be all stitched together on a very long, probably 30-foot long piece of fabric. And there was a fabric conservator who had come through just to see what this item that was just labeled as sample was. And then we spent 2 hours just like going, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, with each other, because it's just the splendor of the craftsmanship and the actual satisfaction of knowing that something like that is physically present for someone to be so excited from. And she was taking pictures of every single square inch of this because she knew that she had found the thing that she was looking for. And there was just this really great sense that I'm like, I knew what I was looking for and I was hoping I knew what this is going to be. And I'm so happy it is exactly what I thought it was going to be.
That is so wonderful, and it goes into an article that I've been reading and that I've really been thinking about by KJ Rawson about how archival material, while it's kept in an archive and it's kept safe, it yearns for use. The kind of desire that is experienced between an object and the researcher and librarian, it's really unlike any other. And especially while we've been studying queer history for years, um, it's really important to note that a lot of queer history is the history of desire. And so as we think about different ways in which access and joy and all these other affective responses that appear negative but really are exposing a lot of the popular trends within archival science, at least how it's conducted in everyday life, it's really important to acknowledge that this material is kept safe to be used, to be seen, to be touched, and that there is an exchange of energy that happens between librarian, researcher, material, the architectural space. It's really one that is interdisciplinary. It's not just the scientific removal of the self in order to study. It includes the body, it includes emotion, it includes joy.
And so I think with that, when we're talking about joy, I think it really links us into the other elements that a lot of these emotions kind of collectively zipper together with this idea of validation. Um, and I think knowing all of the emotions that we endure, there is sort of this sense of like, well, why would I want to keep doing this? If I'm going to be grounded in frustrations and disappointments and dejection and dead ends, um, and sorrow. I think it's just because there's a lot of recollections of just like, so okay, why am I choosing this as a profession? Why am I continuing down this path of education, enrichment, when I know that there are some spaces where it feels like, okay, well, I'm bringing this up, but no one is really doing anything with these points that I'm bringing up. When I'm talking about, you need to talk with your patrons, you need to have an actual conversation with people. You can't just do a cold handoff. You actually need to explain these things. And kind of just being a little bit shocked with the response when the professors are just like, interesting. And, and that's just, and when you sit here and you're just kind of like, okay, well, that's not an answer. That's not what I'm expecting from you as someone who's trying to help me understand moving into a professional space. Because a lot of us are going to be archivists on our own. And I am. I am an archivist on my own in some sense. And so when I'm trying to understand the way that I'm supposed to be in these spaces, it feels wildly inappropriate to be so restrained. Um, Considering the kind of materials that I'm working with, considering the kind of environments and the kind of organizations that I work with, why would I restrain myself? So that's really is, for me at least, the sense of why.
I mean, even in my experiences, a lot of the material that I've been working with has been largely institutional, largely like legal agreements and correspondence about such legal agreements. But what is really fascinating is the human knows no bounds, and it springs up and it makes itself known in these little funny quips between two people discussing a legal agreement, and you can kind of see the humor, the human in these exchanges. And even working with a lot of institutional records, as I have recently at least, it's been really important to understand and to find, why am I doing this? If as we've outlined throughout this whole thing, the negative and disheartening experiences that we've seen, that we've experienced, all of the things that we've read, why do we do it? It's because we do get some validation, we do get joy, and we can give in to the desire, the voyeuristic desire of seeing what history looked like for other people and how it might reflect today in the future. And it's worth understanding and really fighting for the narratives that are within every single aspect of librarianship, of archivistship, from the accessioning, the donor agreement, to finding aid, to the intellectual organization, to the way that a box is handed off to a researcher and that researcher links things together from all these separate places that somehow make total sense, that one we never would have understood before, we never would have thought about.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to think about like if we're having these emotions and people are experiencing these emotions, experiencing these discoveries in real time, then maybe we should be thinking about, is our emotional feedback that we're encountering and experiencing something we should be factoring for? Like if something is creating an emotional response with inside the workspace, if something is happening with our users that and our researchers that's causing a reaction, then then should we be including that into the way that we present things for our patrons? And at the very least, is something that we should be thinking about when creating materials and access points for other people. I mean, emotional development is part of becoming a person. And to encroach some of the most raw forms of human creation, so these are just unpublished, one of a kind things, are the most baseline source of the human condition. To not have an emotional reaction around that, or to at least not spark something emotional within you, and to incense discourage that kind of behavior, is really doing the material a disservice, and it is really doing the profession a disservice as well.
And well, that's I think with that said, I do think that things are not so lost in this moment either. In this moment, we are under intense pressure, but there are engagements with youth and with teenagers that are providing them with the ability to not shunt away these affective responses. There's the Junior Scholars Program at the Schomburg Center in Harlem, with the New York Public Library, which allows underserved teenagers from underserved communities come to the Schomburg Center for Black history and research to utilize the materials, the archival materials that are there, teach them how to use it, and then they create their own reaction, whether that be a play, a spoken word poem, a piece of writing themselves, and they're doing a wonderful job. Children will teach you all the things we don't know about the world, and the fact that all the hope is still there and it's there on purpose, and we should continue allowing children to teach us things. Because this wonderful spoken word discussing from this 18-year-old who was able to utilize his experience in the juniors program to go to college and to continue utilizing primary sources in a way that validates him and that allows him to express all the frustrations that he experiences, but utilizes them in a way that is productive and that allows him to just be a person earlier than a lot of us were.
And so I think this kind of gets to the point of why we wanted to kind of talk about this today, and especially with the collective, as we think about through our own experiences with engaging with this as students and as workers, because, like I mentioned before, we've worn all the hats in relationship to the archival process. We kind of wanted to think about broaching this as a point to think about as a new frame of educational engagement with primary sources, not just with researchers, but also with students, and not students who are MLIS students, but any student who is in a reading room or at a facility online who is engaging with these materials. And knowing that an emotional reaction in any capacity is going to be something that is going to occur. And then having the bandwidth to know how to help either process or at the very least encourage them to move deeper into that space to fully assess how that emotion is actually binded to this image, to these materials, to these items.
And I think affect and education are clearly intrinsically linked, but what we really wanted to bring to this collective today is really to try and break down the barriers between researcher, student, librarian, archivist, kid, adult. I think it's really incredible what teaching with primary sources can do. And there's so much that we can all learn from each other. So it's not necessarily always productive in a reading room to remove or attempt to remove the affect that is experienced, and to really provide space for it is should be intentional, and it'll be something that I'll at least really dedicate myself to in my career.
Yeah. All right. So we'll end our pontificating there. And we'll open it up to some dialogue and some discussions.